The sharp, unsettling hum of JFK Airport filled the air as the rush of travelers moved through the terminals. Max, a seasoned police K-9, walked alongside his handler, Detective James Walker, his nose trained to detect anything unusual. It had been a relatively quiet shift, with nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual bustle of the busiest airport in the world. James, a seasoned detective with dark circles under his eyes, pushed through the crowd, his mind elsewhere. Ever since his wife's untimely death and the mysterious murder of his sister Sarah, he had been living in a fog of grief, clinging to his work as a distraction. But he had never expected the case today would stir up old memories, or open a door he wasn't ready to walk through. "Max, stay sharp," James muttered as they passed a security checkpoint. Max's tail flicked with anticipation, and he tilted his head, his ears standing up. A few steps later, Max began pulling ahead, his eyes fixed on something. James tugged back, surprised at the sudden shift in his dog's demeanor. "Easy, boy, what's going on?" James said, his voice tight with curiosity. Max let out a soft growl, and James knew instantly that something was off. The dog's behavior had changed from its usual obedient routine to something far more serious. James knelt down, his hand brushing Max's fur. "What is it, Max?" Max stepped forward, his nose glued to the floor, moving past a row of luggage. He stopped at a suitcase that had been abandoned near the back of the terminal. The sight of it sent a chill through James. There were hundreds of bags passing through the airport every day, yet something about this one was different. Max's agitation was growing. The suitcase was scuffed, its zipper slightly ajar, and there was an unmistakable sharp odor that began to creep into the air, a scent that made James's stomach churn. "Stay with me, Max," James murmured, his hand steadying the dog. Max let out another growl, now more urgent, as if he was trying to communicate something deeper. James signaled for a nearby officer, who quickly arrived and began securing the area. "Detective, what's the situation?" the officer asked, eyeing Max's increasingly tense body language. "I'm not sure yet," James replied, his voice low but laced with an instinctive unease. He stepped closer to the suitcase, crouching beside it. His hand reached for the latch, his mind racing through 1,000 possibilities. What was this bag hiding? The moment he opened it, the air in the terminal seemed to freeze. Inside the suitcase, wrapped in dark plastic, was a severed hand, the blood still fresh. James felt his breath catch in his throat. He wasn't prepared for this, not after everything he'd already been through. "Get back," he barked to the officer. "Call it in. We've got a crime scene." The officer hesitated, his eyes wide with disbelief, but James didn't wait for a response. He stood up, his pulse quickening. His mind screamed that this was no coincidence. The sight of that hand, the gruesome find, felt too close to the unsolved murder of his sister Sarah. It hit him like a punch to the gut, a dark reminder that some things, no matter how much time passed, would always be waiting for him. Minutes later, Dr. Emily Bennett, the coroner, arrived on the scene. She was professional, calm, and efficient, her demeanor unshaken even in the face of such brutality. She was used to dealing with the macabre, but had never seen a severed limb in such a casual, almost careless manner. She opened the suitcase with a practiced touch, her eyes narrowing as she examined the bloodstains. "Well, this is certainly new," Dr. Bennett said, her tone clinical as she examined the hand. She turned it over carefully, noting the lack of defensive wounds. This was done quickly, and with precision. James watched her, his arms crossed tightly. "What do you mean?" Judging by the lack of any struggle, this wasn't just a random crime. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing," Dr. Bennett continued, flipping through the hand's fingers. "I'm also noticing that there's something off about the condition of the hand. It's been deliberately detached, surgically, not with a blunt force." "Great," James muttered, rubbing his temples. "So we're dealing with someone who knows what they're doing." Max, standing beside him, let out a low growl, his posture tense, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. James ran a hand through his dog's fur, silently acknowledging the trust Max had in him, and the trust he now had in Max. His gut told him that this discovery was just the beginning of something much darker. "Whoever is behind this, they're organized," Dr. Bennett said. "This isn't a crime of passion. Whoever did this, they're methodical." James clenched his jaw. "I know someone like that." Back at the precinct, James began pulling together the initial pieces of the puzzle. He sat in front of his desk, staring at the photograph of the severed hand that had been sent for analysis. His thoughts drifted back to his sister, Sarah. She had been the victim of a brutal, unsolved murder years ago, and the case had haunted him ever since. "James, you're staring a hole in that photograph," came the voice of Robert Collins, an informant who'd been working with the department for years. "We've got a match." The hand came from a human trafficking victim. "It's the same pattern as some of the disappearances we've been seeing across the city." James snapped back into focus, narrowing his eyes at Robert. "Are you saying this is connected?" "I think it is," Robert replied, sitting down across from him. "And I've heard rumors. A man named Daniel Harrison, he's the one behind this. He's been tied to a human trafficking ring for a while now, but no one's ever been able to pin him down. If that suitcase has anything to do with him, you're digging up a hornet's nest, James." James rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Daniel Harrison," he muttered. "I've heard that name before. But it's not just about this hand. This is personal. I need to know everything about him." "I know. And I think you already know what this means, James," Robert said, his voice lower now, a hint of sympathy in his tone. "If you go after Harrison, you'll be poking the bear." James met his gaze, his voice sharp and clear. "I don't care. If there's one thing I know, it's that people like Harrison don't stop until someone stands in their way." James's investigation into Harrison's background revealed a tangled web of corruption, financial crimes, and politicians in high places, many of whom were rumored to be involved in the human trafficking network. The deeper James dug, the more personal it became. He began to recognize connections between Harrison's trafficking operation and high-ranking officials, some of whom had ties to his sister's unsolved murder case. That night, after hours of poring over documents, James leaned back in his chair, exhausted. His mind raced through the possibilities. Had the trafficking ring been responsible for his sister's death? Was this some twisted connection between her murder and the dark forces he was facing now? Max, who had been lying quietly by his side, lifted his head and looked at James. The dog's silent support was all James needed. "Tomorrow," James muttered to himself, "we're going after Harrison. This ends now." The morning after the discovery of the severed hand, James Walker stood in front of his desk, staring at the cluttered file in front of him. His mind was focused on Daniel Harrison and the network he was supposedly running, a network tied to human trafficking and far-reaching corruption. But there was something else gnawing at him, the similarities between this case and the brutal murder of his sister, Sarah. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to push the memories away. Focus. You can't afford to think about her right now. But the pull was strong, and he knew that this case was different. This wasn't just about justice, it was about revenge, about confronting the ghosts from his past. James needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start. His first stop was his father's office. Thomas Walker, a well-known attorney, and someone who had been unknowingly linked to Daniel Harrison. James had always been conflicted about his father's line of work, but now, with everything on the line, he needed to know what his father might have uncovered over the years. The office door creaked open, and James entered, finding his father sitting behind a large oak desk, scribbling notes on a legal pad. "James," Thomas said, without looking up. "I knew you'd come eventually. What's this about?" James stood across from him, his arms crossed. "It's about Harrison," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes hard. "I need to know what you know about him. This isn't just a routine case, this is personal. It's connected to Sarah's murder." Thomas's face softened, but there was an edge to his expression. "I don't know if you're ready for this," he said quietly. "There are things I've uncovered about Harrison's dealings that go far beyond anything you could imagine." "I'm not here for a lecture, Dad," James replied. "I need information now." Thomas sighed, setting down his pen and looking directly at his son. "Harrison's been on my radar for years. He's tied to more than just shady business deals. He's running a trafficking ring, using his influence to protect himself. The people behind him, they have connections to some of the most powerful people in the city." James felt a chill run through him. "So it's worse than I thought." "You have no idea," Thomas said gravely. "But there's more. Harrison didn't just create a network for profit. He's used his connections to shield himself from anyone who could stop him, including the law. That's why this has been so hard to crack." James knew that to get to Harrison, he needed more than just legal documents. He needed an inside man, someone who had seen the darker side of Harrison's operation. That's when he turned to Robert Collins, a reluctant informant who had been coerced into transporting one of Harrison's shipments years ago. Collins had been terrified to speak out, but with the mounting pressure on him, he finally agreed to cooperate. James met Robert at a small diner on the outskirts of the city. The place was nearly empty, save for the sound of clinking silverware and muffled conversation. Robert sat at a corner booth, his eyes scanning the room nervously as James approached. "You sure about this?" Robert asked, his voice low, almost fearful. "If Harrison finds out I'm talking, he won't hesitate to shut me up." "I'm not asking you to go public," James said, sitting down across from him. "I just need the truth. You've seen what Harrison's done. I'm going after him, and I need your help." Robert hesitated, glancing around as if checking for anyone who might be listening. "I don't know where to start, man," he muttered. "I've seen things I can't forget. The shipping routes, the women. They were being moved across borders. But I didn't ask questions, because if I did, I wouldn't be sitting here." "I know," James said, his tone softer now. "You don't need to explain. Just tell me what you know." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands wringing together. "There's a facility out in the outskirts of town, Harrison's base of operations. It's all hidden behind the shipping company. But they have a hidden floor, a basement filled with God knows what." James's heart raced. "We're going there," he said firmly. The deeper James and Robert dug into the trafficking network, the more layers they uncovered. It wasn't just Harrison running the show, it was part of a much larger, deeply entrenched web of corruption. Lawrence Eastman, the CEO of Eastland Shipping, was heavily involved, using his legitimate business as a cover for the illegal operations. James began to piece together a disturbing picture. The network was vast, with ties to politicians, businessmen, and even law enforcement officers. The trafficking ring was the linchpin, enabling Harrison and Eastman to move goods and people across borders with impunity. James couldn't help but feel the weight of his father's earlier words. "This is bigger than you think, James." It wasn't just about Harrison anymore. It was about exposing the entire criminal operation, and the closer James got, the more dangerous it became. Max had always been James's most loyal partner, but now more than ever, the dog was indispensable. The K9 unit played a critical role in tracking down leads, and Max was instrumental in finding key pieces of evidence that could turn the tide in their investigation. One night, as they were combing through an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, Max's nose led them to a hidden compartment. It was a small room, covered in dust, with no obvious signs of entry. But Max's keen sense of smell didn't lie. Inside the compartment was a file filled with damning evidence against Eastman, Harrison, and several other high-profile figures. The documents included contracts, shipping logs, and photographs of the trafficking victims, all confirming the connection between the corrupt elite and the human trafficking ring. "This is it," James whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "We've got them." Max sat beside him, his tail wagging gently as if he knew they had just uncovered the key to breaking the case wide open. James paused for a moment, his heart pounding as he realized the magnitude of what they had just found. But there was no time to celebrate. Harrison's empire wasn't going to fall easily. "James," to Max, "after finding the file, we've got them, boy. We just need to make sure we don't get caught before we bring them down." Robert Collins, nervously, to James, "You don't get it, man. They'll come after you. They'll come after everyone you care about." James, to Robert, "I don't care what they do. We're taking them down, no matter what it takes." As James and Max continued their investigation, the pressure began to mount. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. With every new lead, James could feel the walls closing in, and he began to realize that not everyone in law enforcement could be trusted. Harrison's men were everywhere, and James had to be more careful than ever. But one thing was certain, he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when he was so close to exposing the people who had been running this twisted operation for so long. The investigation had only just begun, and already, James knew it was going to change everything. The days following the discovery of the hidden file filled with evidence were a blur of activity. James could feel the pressure mounting as the stakes got higher. Harrison's trafficking network was far bigger than anyone had initially realized. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that there were not only connections to the criminal underworld but also to influential figures, politicians, businessmen, and law enforcement officers who were all complicit in enabling the trafficking operations to continue unchallenged. James knew the risks. They were no longer dealing with petty criminals. They were up against a well-organized, powerful network. As he and Max continued to follow leads, they found themselves getting closer to the heart of the operation, and more vulnerable to those who were desperate to keep it all hidden. After several days of painstaking investigation, James and his team decided it was time to act. They had a lead on a secret warehouse where victims of the trafficking ring were being held. Intelligence suggested that this could be the key to bringing down the operation. But James knew that storming the facility would be risky. The traffickers were armed and dangerous, and they would likely fight back. "Max, stay close," James muttered as they geared up for the raid. His K9 partner, loyal as ever, sat at attention, sensing the seriousness of the situation. James knew Max's role in the operation was crucial, but he also feared for his safety. The SWAT team arrived at the location, and as they approached the warehouse, James signaled for Max to move in first, using the dog's heightened senses to locate any potential threats. Max moved with precision, his body low to the ground as he sniffed the air, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Everything was moving too fast. The door to the warehouse was forced open, and the SWAT team rushed in. As soon as they entered, the sound of gunshots echoed through the building. Max was the first to dart forward, chasing after a suspect who was trying to escape. James, adrenaline coursing through his veins, followed closely behind. The chaos of the raid made everything feel like it was happening in slow motion. Max charged forward, knocking a suspect down. But just as quickly, another trafficker opened fire, and Max yelped in pain, collapsing to the ground. "No!" James screamed, rushing to his side. Max's body lay limp, but there was still life in his eyes. James's heart pounded in his chest as he knelt beside his partner, his hands trembling. The SWAT team handled the rest of the suspects, but for James, everything had stopped in that moment. "Hang in there, buddy," James whispered, holding Max close. "We're not done yet." The following days were a blur of hospital visits, tests, and uncertainty. Max had been injured during the raid, and while the bullet had grazed his side, he was recovering. The doctor was confident Max would make a full recovery, but it was clear that James was taking the injury personally. He spent every moment at the hospital by Max's side, whispering words of encouragement, though his own heart felt heavy. While Max was recovering, James focused on digging deeper into the human trafficking network. The evidence they had already gathered from Robert Collins, the shipping logs, and the file from the hidden warehouse painted a clearer picture of the scale of the operation. However, it became evident that dismantling the network wasn't going to be as simple as taking down a few key figures. The trafficking ring was protected by a web of corruption, with influential players ensuring that Harrison and his associates remained untouchable. James began connecting the dots between Harrison, Lawrence Eastman, and several prominent politicians. The realization hit him hard: this wasn't just about a criminal ring. This was a political machine designed to operate in the shadows, and the more he uncovered, the more dangerous it became. One evening, after reviewing the evidence, James met with Dr. Emily Bennett, the medical examiner, who had been instrumental in identifying the trafficking victims. They met in her office, where she was carefully analyzing new evidence recovered from the warehouse. "James, we need to talk about something," Dr. Bennett said, her voice low. "I've been going over the medical reports from the victims we found in the warehouse. There's something disturbing." James leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "What is it?" "The victims weren't just trafficked. Some of them were experimented on," Dr. Bennett said, her tone grim. "I've found scars and surgical marks that suggest they were used for medical or biological experiments, human testing. This is beyond trafficking. Someone's using these people for something else entirely." James felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Who would do something like that? And why? "I don't know," Dr. Bennett replied, her voice filled with concern. "But whoever's behind this is powerful, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to keep it covered up." James stood up, his fists clenched. "Then it's even worse than I thought. We're not just dealing with criminals anymore. We're dealing with an organization that needs to be stopped before it does any more damage." As the investigation unfolded, James couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. He had always suspected there was a connection between the trafficking network and his sister's murder. Now more than ever, he felt it in his gut: this was personal. The victims, the connections to high-ranking officials, the corruption at every level, it all led back to something dark, something that had been hidden for far too long. James was determined to uncover the truth, but it was clear that the closer he got, the more dangerous the case became. Late one night, while reviewing the evidence at home, James's phone rang. It was an anonymous tip, the voice on the other end low and hurried. "They're watching you," the voice said. "Harrison has connections everywhere. Be careful." Before James could respond, the call ended abruptly. He looked at the phone, feeling a surge of dread. "Too late for that," James muttered, staring out the window. "I'm already in too deep." The tension in the air was palpable as James and his team closed in on the final pieces of the puzzle. Every lead they followed seemed to expose a deeper layer of the web of corruption that had entangled high-ranking officials, politicians, and powerful business figures. They were getting closer to Harrison, Lawrence Eastman, and Blackwood, figures who had been using their influence to shield themselves from justice. James sat in his office late into the night, staring at the array of documents spread out in front of him. The shipping logs, the bank records, and the photographs of trafficking victims were all leading to the same place, a final confrontation. But with each piece of the puzzle, the danger grew. Dr. Emily Bennett had been working tirelessly on the forensic evidence, and she had just made a breakthrough. She called James into her office to discuss what she had uncovered. "James," she said, her voice tight with urgency, "I think I found something that links the trafficking ring to someone much higher up than we realized. There's a pattern in the financial records. It's not just Harrison, there's someone else pulling the strings." James leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Who?" "It's Blackwood," Dr. Bennett replied. "I've cross-referenced the financial data from Eastman's company and found a hidden account linked directly to Blackwood. He's been using his position as a politician to protect Harrison and Eastman. This is much bigger than we thought." James's stomach tightened. So Blackwood's been behind all this. He's the one making sure Harrison stays untouchable. "That's right," Dr. Bennett confirmed. "And from what I've gathered, Blackwood's political career is built on dirty money from the trafficking network. He's got a stake in everything: shipping, pharmaceuticals, construction. You name it." James stood up, his fists clenched. "We need to take him down now." With the evidence in hand, James and his team formulated a plan to take down Blackwood and the entire trafficking network. They would need to move quickly and quietly to avoid tipping off the corrupt officials who were involved. The plan was simple: coordinate a raid on Blackwood's mansion, arrest the key players, and seize all incriminating evidence. But as they prepared for the operation, James received another anonymous tip. This time, it was from someone inside Blackwood's camp, someone who had had enough. "They're going to make a move on you tonight," the voice warned. "They know you're close. If you want to make it out alive, move fast." James's heart raced as he hung up the phone. The stakes had never been higher. He gathered his team and Max, who had fully recovered from his injuries, and they set out for Blackwood's estate. Under the cover of darkness, James and his team made their way to Blackwood's mansion, a sprawling estate located in a secluded part of the city. The house was heavily guarded, but with the information they had, James knew they could slip past the security and get inside. "Max, stay close," James whispered as they approached the front gate. Max, alert and focused, stood by his side. They had been through so much together, and James trusted his K9 partner with his life. The SWAT team moved in, and within moments, they were inside. James led the charge, knowing this was their one shot to bring down Blackwood and the people who had been trafficking women and children for years. The air was thick with anticipation, and every step they took brought them closer to the truth. Inside, they found a hidden room, a chamber filled with trophies and artifacts, many of which were tied to the victims of the trafficking operation. Photographs, passports, and personal items from the victims lined the walls. James's stomach turned as he looked at the evidence. These were the things Blackwood had kept, the reminders of his reign of terror. "This ends now," James muttered under his breath. They moved quickly, securing the mansion and arresting everyone inside, including Blackwood, who had been attempting to flee. It was clear now that the politicians and businessmen who had been involved in the trafficking network were no longer untouchable. As James and his team secured the final suspects, Max was sent to clear a back room. It was a small, dimly lit area, but when Max entered, his sharp eyes locked onto something at the far corner of the room. James followed him inside, only to find another victim, barely conscious, her body beaten and bruised. "Max, good boy," James whispered, his voice full of relief. "You found her." Max stood at attention, his eyes locked on James, as if waiting for further instructions. The victim, a young woman in her 20s, trembled as James approached. He knelt beside her, gently touching her arm. "You're safe now," James said softly. "We're going to get you out of here." The woman, barely able to speak, nodded weakly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't think anyone was coming." In the weeks following the raid, the arrests and subsequent trial shook the city to its core. Blackwood, Harrison, and the others involved in the trafficking operation were charged with numerous crimes, from human trafficking to murder. The corrupt officials who had shielded them for so long were exposed, and the trafficking ring was dismantled. For James, the victory was bittersweet. While he had succeeded in bringing justice to the victims, he couldn't shake the haunting memory of his sister Sarah. The case had drawn too many parallels to her murder, and though the network had been shut down, the closure he sought for his sister's death was still out of reach. "Max," James said one evening, as he sat in his office, looking at the case files. "We did what we could. But it's never over, is it?" Max lay at his feet, his head resting on the floor. The dog's steady presence was a comfort, even if it couldn't bring back what James had lost. Still, as he looked out the window, he realized that he had a purpose, one that he would continue to fulfill. The story concluded with a foundation being established in Sarah's memory, an organization dedicated to helping the victims of human trafficking, ensuring that the work James and Max had started would live on. James returned to duty, his heart heavy but resolute. He had done what he could to stop the network, but he knew the fight wasn't over. With Max by his side, he would continue working to protect the innocent and fight for justice. In a quiet moment, James looked down at his partner. "We're not done yet, buddy," he whispered. "There are still people out there who need us." Max lifted his head, his eyes calm and knowing, as if to say, "I'm ready." The days following the successful takedown of Daniel Harrison, Blackwood, and their associates were a blur of activity. News outlets covered the raid, the arrests, and the dismantling of one of the largest human trafficking operations in the city's history. For James Walker, the victory was bittersweet. While he had exposed the criminals, shut down the trafficking ring, and uncovered the deep-seated corruption that had allowed it to thrive, he couldn't escape the haunting memory of his sister's murder. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation as James walked into the courtroom with Max by his side. Harrison, Blackwood, and the other key figures in the trafficking ring were all facing multiple charges. The media, having followed the case closely, were ready for the trial to begin. As the defendants stood before the judge, James couldn't help but feel a sense of justice, but it wasn't enough to fill the emptiness left by his sister's unsolved death. "Do you think this is enough?" James muttered to himself as he watched Harrison stand arrogantly in the dock. He felt a weight in his chest. He had done everything he could to bring down the operation, but there was a part of him that felt as if the closure he desperately needed was still just out of reach. Max, sensing his handler's distress, sat down at James's side, his eyes calm and steady. James reached down and gently patted Max's head, grateful for the unspoken bond between them. "You've done more than anyone could ever ask of you, Max. You've been my strength." In the weeks following the trial, James made it his mission to continue his sister's legacy. He used his family's connections and his newfound platform to create the Sarah Walker Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing support for victims of human trafficking, offering them resources for recovery, and helping them reintegrate into society. The foundation became a beacon of hope for many who had been silenced by the horrors they had endured. James spoke at events, sharing his experience and advocating for justice. But it wasn't just about the victims, it was also about honoring Sarah, his sister, who had been taken from him so suddenly and violently. The foundation became a way for him to keep her memory alive, even if he couldn't yet solve the mystery of her death. One evening, as James sat at his desk, sifting through the endless paperwork for the foundation, he found a photo of his sister, Sarah. She had been smiling in the picture, carefree and happy, before everything had gone wrong. He stared at it for a long moment, the guilt creeping in as always. He couldn't help but feel as though he had failed her. "What could I have done differently?" James muttered, his voice heavy with sorrow. "How did I let this go on for so long?" Max padded over to him, laying his head on James's lap, offering comfort without words. "You're right, buddy," James whispered, his voice hoarse. We did it. Together, we brought justice for the victims. We stopped Harrison, and we stopped Blackwood. But I still haven't found the answers I need." James ran a hand over his face, the weariness evident in his eyes. The work was far from over, but it had taken a toll on him. Yet, with Max by his side, he was starting to realize that it wasn't about finding the perfect closure, it was about continuing to do the work, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And most importantly, it was about never giving up, no matter how hard the journey became. Max had been a partner in every sense of the word. His loyalty, instinct, and bravery had led to countless breakthroughs in the investigation. Max's role as a police K-9 unit was far from over, but James began to think about what came next for them both. The police force had been incredibly supportive, but it was clear that James and Max had formed a unique bond, one that extended beyond the job. Max was more than a working dog. He was a companion, a protector, and a friend. As Max's recovery from his injury progressed, James knew that they would continue to work together, but it was time for them to find a new purpose. As the foundation began to take shape, James found himself in a place of emotional recovery. He had taken a step forward, accepting that closure might never come fully, but that he could still make a difference. The legacy of the Sarah Walker Foundation, the lives saved, and the justice served filled the void in ways he hadn't expected. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, James sat on the porch of his home, looking out over the city skyline. Max, now fully recovered, lay at his feet. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over everything. "You know, buddy," James said softly, his voice reflective. "This is what we were meant to do. Not just to bring down criminals, but to help those who need it the most. You've been with me through the darkest times, and I won't forget that." Max shifted slightly, looking up at James with those wise, knowing eyes. "We've got work to do, but we're not alone anymore," James continued. "There are people who care, and there's a future worth fighting for. And it starts here. With us." The two of them sat in silence as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon. James knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more cases, more struggles, and more challenges, but with Max by his side and the support of the foundation, he felt ready for whatever came next. As James stood at the foundation's grand opening ceremony, his heart swelled with pride. He had faced unimaginable challenges, but he had emerged stronger. The truth had been uncovered, the criminals had been brought to justice, and most importantly, lives had been saved. The final shot of the story was a poignant moment between James and Max, standing together as partners, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. They had found their way through the darkness, and now, they were helping others find the light. This story explores the journey of Detective James Walker and his loyal police dog Max, as they work together to unravel a powerful human trafficking operation. As James uncovers the truth, he faces not only external threats but also the internal struggle of losing his sister and wife. The investigation becomes personal, and through determination and loyalty, James and Max expose corruption at the highest levels while seeking justice for those who have been silenced. The story underscores the importance of resilience, justice, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. The story sends a powerful message about the impact of perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds. It shows that even when justice seems impossible, there are always people, like James and Max, who refuse to give up. The tale highlights the importance of standing up against human trafficking and corruption, as well as the strength found in partnership, loyalty, and love. It also teaches the value of helping those who cannot help themselves, emphasizing the need for social responsibility and empathy. If this story moved you, we invite you to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know how you felt about James and Max's journey. Your feedback and support mean everything to us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on more powerful and inspiring stories that bring hope and change. Your engagement is a great motivator for us to continue producing meaningful content. We want to extend a heartfelt thank you for watching this story. Your support and encouragement keep us motivated to bring more powerful and emotional narratives. Thank you for being part of this journey, and we look forward to sharing more with you in the future. Stay tuned for more stories that will touch your heart.